His blood was found in the living room by the entry-exit door to the porch.
I had missing person flyers printed up and sent copies of the flyers to every police post in the state.
The door with no answer. And I opened the door and she was laying in a puddle of blood in the middle of the floor. The worst moment of my life.
What if a mystery that lasted for years was finally solved after everyone thought it was hopeless?
There's nothing forensic, nothing physical to tie the Jones brothers to the death of Shannon Siders. It was not presented in court.
For a long time, these cold cases had no answers. Families kept hoping, detectives kept searching, but the truth stayed hidden.
I'm just hoping she's still alive someplace. We're hoping. Yes, hope, praying.
She wouldn't hurt anyone ever. And if they just please wouldn't hurt her. I don't care who they are, if they would just let us know where she is.
Then, one day, something changed. A new clue, new technology, or someone finally spoke up.
The Honolulu Prosecutor's Office secured an indictment against Mr. Trillo for murder in late September of 2022, and then sought to extradite him to Honolulu.
These stories show how even after many years, justice can still be found.
She suffered at least 63 separate and distinct injuries.
I think Nancy was afraid of something or someone.
Do you in your heart believe that this is the truth, that he is finally telling the truth?
I think it's the truth. I think Mr. Robinson has absolutely nothing to gain.
In this video, we'll explore real-life stories of shocking cold cases solved after decades. Let's get started. Let's start with the heartbreaking case of Shannon Siders, whose tragic disappearance and brutal murder in 1989 remain unsolved for decades. Shannon Siders. Shannon Siders was an 18-year-old living in Newaygo, Michigan, with her father, Bob Siders. A single father, Bob had raised Shannon on his own since his divorce years earlier. On the evening of July 17, 1989, when Bob returned home the next morning, he was alarmed to find that Shannon wasn't there. He searched for her in the house and neighborhood, but all in vain. Determined to find her, he printed and distributed missing person flyers across the state, pleading for information about Shannon's whereabouts.
I had missing person flyers printed up and sent copies of the flyers to every police post in the state.
Weeks later, during Labor Day weekend, a hunter in the area found a body in the Red Pine Plantation, a dense woodland used for deer hunting. The body was identified as Shannon Siders. Investigators determined that Shannon had been brutally murdered. She had been beaten to death, and evidence suggested she had been sexually assaulted. The injuries to her body, including signs of mutilation, pointed to a violent and cruel attack. As police began interviewing people who were with Shannon on the night she disappeared, 8 individuals emerged as the last people to see her alive. Among them were brothers Paul and Matt Jones, who said they had driven Shannon home. They described seeing the porch light on, the TV flickering through the window, and her dog inside, which investigators initially believed confirmed their story. Both brothers passed polygraph tests, and the case went cold for years.
All they had was conjecture and statements and what people said they heard from the boys that sounded incriminating.
Additional testimony came from Dean Robinson, who claimed he had witnessed the Jones brothers with Shannon's lifeless body in the woods. He alleged that they had beaten and raped Shannon before murdering her and threatening him when he tried to intervene. Based on this testimony and other circumstantial evidence, the Jones brothers were arrested in 2015. Paul and Matt were convicted and sentenced. Paul to 30 to 75 years and Matt to life in prison. For a time, it seemed Shannon's family had justice. Years later, the case took another shocking turn. Private investigator Bill Proctor, a former journalist, began investigating the case and uncovered additional troubling details. He found no physical evidence linking the Jones brothers to Shannon's murder. DNA analysis of hair found in Shannon's hand did not match the brothers, and forensic examinations of their car revealed no evidence of violence or criminal activity. Even a 1993 polygraph test that Matt Jones had passed was never introduced at trial. Proctor's investigation suggested that law enforcement had focused too heavily on the Jones brothers without solid evidence. He argued that their convictions were based on flawed witness testimony and lacked any definitive proof. The possibility of a wrongful conviction loomed large, leaving Shannon's family and the community to question if the real killer had escaped justice.
That this was more than a mistake. It is a wrongful conviction, that it should not be. The Jones brothers did not have anything to do with the death of Shannon Siders.
Despite the revelations, no new suspects have been identified, and the truth about Shannon's murder remains uncertain. Proctor called for a re-examination of the case, believing the Jones brothers deserve a new trial. As of now, the case remains a tragic example of how complex and heartbreaking cold cases can be, with lives shattered not just by the crime itself, but by the unanswered questions that linger for decades. Let's move on to the chilling case of Lori Ann Smith, whose brutal murder went unsolved for over 2 decades, until DNA technology finally uncovered the shocking truth. Lori Ann Smith. Lori Ann Smith, a 28-year-old woman from Cliftondale, Georgia, was beloved by her family, friends, and her small-town community. After college, Lori made the decision to move into a house next door to her parents, wanting to be close to the people she loved the most. Ironically, this decision to stay near her family would ultimately lead to their worst nightmare. One evening, after camping out with her friends, Lori told her mother that she was feeling very tired. She went back home, just a few hundred feet away, unaware of the horrifying events about to unfold. Hours later, her mother became concerned when she couldn't reach Lori. Worried, she walked over to Lori's house, knocked on the door, and called out. But there was no answer. Eventually, she opened the door and was met with a sight no parent should ever witness. Lori was lying in a pool of blood on the floor. Her mother immediately called 911, devastated and in shock.
On the door with no answer. I opened the door and she was laying in a puddle of blood in the middle of the floor. The worst moment of my life.
When investigators arrived, the crime scene painted a picture of a savage struggle. Lori had been brutally attacked, sustaining multiple gunshot wounds along with abrasions and contusions on her arms, legs, and face. Her home showed clear signs of a violent confrontation. Lamps were overturned, sheets were pulled off the bed, and Lori was found unclothed, suggesting she fought desperately to survive. Investigators found a key piece of evidence: blood that didn't belong to Lori. It was found near the entry door leading to the porch. Detectives believed Lori had managed to injure her attacker during the struggle, causing him to bleed heavily, or that the attacker may have accidentally shot himself during the chaos. This discovery gave investigators a crucial lead: the suspect's DNA. However, despite this critical evidence, detectives were unable to identify the perpetrator. Over the years, they eliminated over 119 potential suspects through DNA testing, but the case grew cold, leaving Lori's family without answers.
We've eliminated over 119 people that we've collected DNA from. It is frustrating to have the evidence you need, but you just cannot put a name to that evidence that you have.
For more than 20 years, Lori's murder haunted her family and stumped investigators. But advancements in DNA technology eventually reignited hope. Detectives resubmitted the suspect's DNA to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in advanced forensic DNA analysis. Using a cutting-edge program called Snapshot, scientists reversed engineered the suspect's genetic markers to create a composite image of what he likely looked like at the time of the murder and how he might look decades later. When the composite images were revealed, no one recognized the suspect, leaving investigators and Lori's family frustrated once again. But another technological tool would soon crack the case. Using the same familial DNA technology that led to the capture of the infamous Golden State Killer, investigators searched ancestry databases for a potential match to the suspect's DNA. And finally, they got a hit.
When we actually saw that image, none of us recognized that person.
The DNA led investigators to Jerry Lee, a former correctional officer who had lived less than a mile from Lori at the time of the murder. Detectives obtained a search warrant to collect Lee's DNA, and the results were undeniable. It was a match. After 26 long years, Lori's killer had finally been identified. In court, Jerry Lee pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, burglary, and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison. While the conviction brought some measure of justice, Lori's family was left grappling with their grief, knowing they would never truly get over her loss. Lori Ann Smith's case is a powerful reminder of how advancements in technology and persistent investigators can bring long-awaited answers, even after decades. For Lori's family, the knowledge that her killer was finally held accountable provided some closure, but the pain of her brutal and untimely death remains a permanent scar on their lives. Now, let's move into the tragic case of Nancy Anderson, murdered in her Honolulu apartment in 1972, whose killer was finally identified nearly 50 years later through the latest technology. Nancy Anderson. Nancy Anderson was a vibrant young woman with a bright future ahead of her. Nancy's family relocated to Arvada, Colorado in June 1971, hoping for a fresh start. But Nancy, longing for adventure and independence, moved to Honolulu, Hawaii in October of the same year. She returned to Arvada for Christmas, and her family noticed that she seemed uneasy, as if she feared something or someone.
I think
Tragically, Nancy's premonitions
was afraid of
proved to be
something or
true.
someone.
On January 7th, 1972, Nancy's roommate came home to their Honolulu apartment and found Nancy lying lifeless on her bedroom floor. Alarmed by the sound of running water coming from the bathroom, she initially suspected suicide and called for help. However, when officers arrived at the Coral Terrace apartments, the scene told a very different story. There were no signs of forced entry, and Nancy's body bore the horrifying evidence of a brutal crime. Nancy was found fully clothed, lying on the floor next to one of the twin beds in her bedroom. Her blouse was partially ripped, and she had sustained
She
over
suffered
60
at least
stab
63
wounds and incised
separate and distinct
injuries, indicating a ferocious attack. Bloodstained towels were discovered near her body and throughout the apartment building, including one in a stairwell, suggesting the attacker had tried to stop their own bleeding. Investigators quickly ruled out suicide and determined that Nancy had been murdered in a crime of extreme violence and passion. From the start, detectives suspected the crime was deeply personal. The sheer number of stab wounds indicated intense anger or emotion. A weapon was never recovered, but investigators believed it was likely a small paring knife based on the nature of Nancy's injuries. They scoured the kitchen, but found no signs of a missing knife. Bloodstained towels and evidence near the scene suggested the killer might have injured themselves during the attack. Despite their efforts, the case went cold. With limited forensic technology in the 1970s, there was little more investigators could do. Honolulu, though a large city, had relatively few violent crimes at the time. Nancy's case stood out not only for its brutality, but also for its lack of leads. Detectives suspected the killer was someone Nancy knew, as the attack appeared to be fueled by emotion. However, no suspects could be identified, and the investigation had stalled by the end of 1972. Fast forward nearly 50 years, and advances in DNA technology brought new hope to Nancy's case. Evidence collected at the crime scene, including bloodstained towels, contained DNA from an unknown male. Investigators tested the DNA against state and offender databases but found no matches. That's when they turned to C.C. Moore, a chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, who had gained national recognition for solving cold cases using familial DNA. Moore analyzed the DNA and traced the suspect's ancestry to southern Italy, central Italy, and Sicily. She took an innovative approach by examining Honolulu's city directory from the time of the murder, cross-referencing names with Italian origins. Her meticulous work led her to a man named Tudor Chirilla, who had lived in Honolulu during Nancy's murder. In 2019, Honolulu police contacted Tudor Chirilla, now living in Reno, Nevada, and collected his DNA. When compared to the DNA found at the crime scene, it was a match. Investigators discovered that Chirilla had been a graduate assistant in Hawaii at the time of the murder. He later went on to serve as a deputy attorney general in Nevada, a chilling revelation given his history of violence. In September 2022, prosecutors secured an indictment against Chirilla for Nancy's murder and began the process of extraditing him back to Hawaii. However, before the case could go to trial, Chirilla fell ill while in custody and passed away on Christmas Day, 2022, at the age of 78. Although he was never convicted in a court of law, investigators and Nancy's family felt confident they had finally uncovered the truth. Nancy's case exemplifies the power of modern DNA technology in solving cold cases. Through innovative tools like genetic genealogy and Parabon Nanolab's snapshot program, detectives were able to bring closure to a family that had waited decades for answers. Investigators believe the intense nature of the crime, over 60 stab wounds, points to a highly personal motive, possibly fueled by anger or rejection. Technology can bring justice to victims, even decades after their lives were tragically cut short. Next, let's look at the tragic case of Kathy Hawley, who disappeared in 1979, and whose murder was finally linked to a serial killer over 40 years later. Kathy Hawley. In 1979, 19-year-old Kathy Hawley lived in an apartment complex in North Aurora, Illinois. She disappeared on March 29, 1979, while heading out to pick up her sister. Kathy never made it, and her family's worst fears were realized 3 weeks later when her body was discovered in the Fox River, just south of the I-88 bridge.
I'm just hoping she's still alive someplace. We're hoping against hope, praying.
She wouldn't hurt anyone ever. And if they just please wouldn't hurt her. I don't care who they are if they would just let us know where she is.
However, despite the efforts of investigators, the case went cold. Kathy's murder, though tragic and shocking, remained unsolved for decades. In 2019, a breakthrough in another cold case in Lisle, Illinois, gave North Aurora police new hope in solving Kathy's murder. Advances in DNA technology, including a technique called MVAC, allowed forensic scientists to recover and analyze even small and degraded DNA samples. A Florida-based company specializing in DNA investigations analyzed evidence from Kathy's clothing, which had been preserved since her body was recovered from the river. They discovered DNA from an unknown male that had gone undetected in earlier investigations. The DNA matched Bruce Lindahl, a suspected serial killer whose crimes spanned multiple years in the 1970s and early 1980s. Investigators believe Lindahl abducted Kathy from the parking lot of her apartment complex and later killed her near the Fox River. The breakthrough in Kathy's case also linked Lindahl to other crimes, including the rape and murder of 15-year-old Pamela Maurer of Woodbridge in 1976. Pamela's body was also discovered near Lisle. Bruce Lindahl was a deeply disturbed man with a history of violence. In 1981, while committing another murder in Naperville, Illinois, he accidentally stabbed himself and died on top of his victim. Authorities later exhumed Lindahl's body to obtain DNA samples, which helped link him to Kathy's murder and other crimes. Lindahl's DNA matched evidence from both Kathy Holly's and Pamela Mauer's cases, cementing his role as a serial killer responsible for multiple rapes and murders. After 45 years, Kathy's family finally received some measure of closure. While revisiting the case was incredibly painful, they expressed gratitude for the advances in DNA technology and the persistence of law enforcement that ultimately brought answers. In a statement read by North Aurora's deputy chief, the family shared their relief at finally knowing the truth. Even though the journey had been long and heartbreaking, law enforcement officials, including the Kane County State's Attorney, confirmed that if Lindahl were still alive, he would have been charged with first-degree murder in Kathy's case. While his death prevented him from facing justice in a court of law, investigators and Kathy's family are confident that Lindahl was responsible for her tragic death. As we've seen today, even the coldest cases can eventually find answers, thanks to relentless investigators, advancing technology, and the determination of loved ones who never give up hope. These stories remind us that justice can be delayed, but it's not always out of reach. If you found these cases as shocking and fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. And remember, every share could bring more attention to unsolved cases still waiting for answers.